You draw parallels, Dr. Cronje, with the genocide and apartheid claims against Israel by South Africa and in the World Fora. You draw parallels between that and the way America lost the war in Vietnam. Can you briefly explain that, Dr. Cronje?
Yeah, I think for any Westerner who's grown up in the post-Cold War world, I think a weakness in the West is the idea that the Cold War was won. And if you're a young political leader today in the West, or think tank leader, or policymaker, or national security person, you've probably grown up in an environment where you do not have living memory experience of ideological warfare and how powerful that can be in giving a less well-armed, less well-equipped terror organization, for example, the ability to challenge a much better equipped, much wealthier, much more prosperous, much more technologically advanced adversary. Now, towards the final stages of the Vietnam War, and the Vietnamese were very good at this stuff. They were backed by the East Germans, obviously, and the Soviets, who at the time were the masters of the art. And South Africa's then liberation movements, or the centerpiece of that, was the African National Congress, the party that still governs South Africa today. They went to visit the Vietnamese, and particularly General Giap, still in the tunnels in Vietnam. And they learned a great deal about ideological warfare from there, and then later themselves from the East Germans and the Soviets. And I think the comment that a lot of Western observers of this current conflict in Gaza need to have in mind is the lament that the Supreme Commander of the U.S. forces in Vietnam later agreed with, General Westmoreland, that the Americans lost the war there, not in the jungles of Southeast Asia, but on the streets of Washington and in the living rooms of America. And I think there's a risk within Israel, within its security establishment. I think it's a risk that exists, and vulnerability amongst Western national security thinkers broadly, that their unrivaled economic and technological and military superiority keeps them safe. And what they're going to learn out of this ICJ case that's just passed and related efforts on the part of the South Africans is that if your defensive strategies, if your deterrence ability to head off ideological attacks and diplomatic attacks on the scale of what the South Africans launched, I mean, what the South Africans launched was the diplomatic version of October the 7th. If you cannot fend off those kinds of attacks effectively in the fullness of time, your technological and traditional military advantages will be eroded to a point that you become very vulnerable to threats posed by autocratic societies or terror groups such as Hamas.
And just very, very briefly, Dr. Cronje, we're seeing these protests in Australia, around the Western world, exactly as happened in Vietnam, so I think your analogy is very valid. Just very quickly, in 30 seconds, your opinion on what happens now that the ICJ has made this kind of half-baked ruling.
Well, I think it's perverse. You know, the ICJ is bought into the South African thesis to a far too deep an extent, and the kind of messaging that you do need out of the Western world is to thank the Israelis and thank the brave soldiers of the IDF and thank their family members, because what they're doing in Gaza today and in other parts of the Middle East is heading off a very dangerous threat to the Western world broadly. And if that fight can't be won in Gaza, if it can't be won in the frontline states around Israel, in the fullness of time, you, your family, and your kids in Western capitals are going to face the consequences of that. So, yeah, hopefully Western democracies learn to see through this, learn to see through the fact that the UN as an institution is dominated by non-liberal democratic states. They shouldn't be ceding any moral authority to that institution or any panel or subcommittee, the ICJ included, that is linked or tied to it or falls underneath.
Dr. Frans Cronje, thank you so much for coming on Outsiders this morning with these wise words and warnings. Stay safe. Thank you very much, Dr. Frans Cronje.